Stop what you're doing for a second, because this is one of those moments that looks like another noisy geopolitical headline until you realize the ground may actually be shifting underneath it. Because this is not just about Israel anymore. This is not just about Iran. This is not just about Lebanon. This is not just about another ceasefire that might hold for 48 hours and then collapse by the weekend. This is about something bigger. It is about what happens when country after country, some openly, some cautiously, some opportunistically, starts moving into the same political direction at the same time. And right now, that direction is pressure on Israel. Not identical pressure. Not pressure for the same reasons. Not pressure from allies and rivals who suddenly agree on everything, but pressure all the same. And that is why this story matters so much. Because when you start hearing Turkey, China, Russia, UN officials, European governments, and even growing parts of Washington all speaking in tones that are sharper, colder, and more openly critical than before, you are no longer looking at routine diplomatic noise. You are looking at the possibility that Israel is entering a phase of this conflict where the battlefield is not the only place it is under strain. The diplomatic battlefield is heating up too. And Washington, for all its power, looks increasingly like a country trying to hold together a system that is starting to pull apart in multiple directions at once. Turkey's President Erdogan said this week that Ankara is working to extend the US-Iran ceasefire and criticized Israel's attacks in Lebanon as harmful to peace efforts. Reuters also reported that Spain has escalated its criticism of both Israel and the US, while Austria, historically one of Israel's friendlier voices in Europe, demanded that Israel stop attacking civilian targets in Lebanon. Now let's slow this down, because the easiest mistake to make here is to hear a dramatic title like this and think the whole world has suddenly lined up in one neat anti-Israel bloc. That is not what is happening. Russia is not criticizing Israel for the same reason Spain is. Turkey is not acting from the same strategic logic as China. Austria is not speaking with the same tone as Moscow. And Washington is not out of options, in the literal sense. But here is what is happening. The coalition of voices willing to publicly condemn Israeli actions is getting wider. The political cost of standing too close to Israel is rising in some capitals. The gap between Washington's position and that of key partners is becoming harder to hide. And the longer this war drags on, the more difficult it becomes for the US to claim that it still fully controls the diplomatic map around Israel. Reuters reported that UN experts condemned Israeli strikes in Lebanon as illegal aggression, while Spain called for the EU to suspend its association agreement with Israel, and Austria separately called on Israel to stop hitting civilian targets. That is the real story. Not perfect unity against Israel, but widening convergence against what Israel is doing right now. And that distinction matters, because it tells you this is not a temporary social media storm. It is structural. Now here is where things get serious. For years, one of Israel's core strategic advantages has not just been military power. It has also been the assumption that when things get ugly, Washington will still hold the center, Europe will grumble but mostly stay manageable, and rival powers like China and Russia will criticize from the sidelines without fundamentally changing the Western political balance. But what happens when the center itself starts to wobble? What happens when US backing remains strong but more politically expensive? What happens when Europe becomes less unified in Israel's favor and more vocal in public criticism? What happens when Turkey sees an opening to position itself as a regional power broker? What happens when China presents itself as the calm, stability-focused actor while the US is tied to war? What happens when Russia, even while deeply compromised elsewhere, sees another chance to attack US credibility? That is the situation now. And it is exactly why this moment is more dangerous than it first appears. Turkey is a perfect place to start. Erdogan said on April 15th that Turkey is working to extend the Iran ceasefire and continue diplomacy, and he directly criticized Israeli strikes in Lebanon for undermining peace efforts. That matters because Turkey is not some distant commentator. It is a NATO member, a regional power, and a country that often tries to turn crisis into leverage. Ankara is not just complaining, it is trying to be in the room where the next phase gets shaped. Now look at Europe. Again, not all of Europe in some simple unified sense, but the direction of travel is unmistakable in several capitals. Reuters reported that Spain has intensified its criticism of Israel and the United States, condemned Israeli attacks in Lebanon, and even called for the European Union to suspend its association agreement with Israel. Austria, a country not known for reflexive anti-Israel positioning, also publicly demanded that Israel stop attacking civilian targets and infrastructure in Lebanon. And UN experts have condemned recent Israeli strikes in Lebanon in extraordinarily severe terms. That combination matters, because one government criticizing Israel is a headline. Several governments, plus UN voices, plus growing humanitarian outrage, plus fresh diplomatic efforts around Lebanon, that starts to look like momentum. And momentum in international politics is dangerous because it creates its own force. Once countries see that criticism is spreading, more governments become willing to say publicly what they were previously saying only in private. The AP also reported that Lebanon and Israel have now held their first direct diplomatic talks in decades in Washington, which shows how badly the U.S. wants to contain the widening fallout of the Israel-Hezbollah war. Now bring China into the picture. China is not leading anti-Israel rallies. It is doing something smarter. It is framing itself as the adult in the room. Reuters reported that China has described the U.S.-Iran ceasefire as very fragile, urged opposition to escalation, and called for restraint. Beijing is not moving emotionally here. It is moving strategically. It sees an American-backed regional order under strain, a Washington administration tied to military pressure and economic disruption, and a chance to position itself as the advocate of stability, de-escalation, and global economic calm. That is not a minor development. Because in great power politics, image matters. If the U.S. looks like the patron of escalation while China looks like the patron of restraint, that changes the atmosphere in countries that do not want to choose sides but do want stability. And then there is Russia. Russia's approach is different again. Moscow is not suddenly becoming a neutral peacemaker. But it does benefit whenever the U.S. looks overextended, divided from allies, or unable to impose a coherent settlement on a conflict involving one of its closest regional partners. Even where Russia's latest statements are aimed more directly at Europe and Ukraine, they fit into a wider pattern, use every crisis to erode Western confidence, widen splits, and make American leadership look brittle. So no, these countries are not part of one neat alliance against Israel. But yes, they are all, in different ways, contributing to a broader environment in which Israel is under more diplomatic pressure and Washington is under more strategic pressure. That is the part no one should miss. Now here is the contradiction. Washington is still enormously powerful. It still arms Israel. It still shapes diplomacy. It still convenes talks. It still matters more than any outside power in determining whether a ceasefire survives or collapses. And yet, at the same time, Washington looks increasingly constrained. The AP reported today that the U.S. Senate rejected efforts to halt arms sales to Israel, but more than 36 Democrats supported those measures, showing a real shift inside American politics. That does not mean the U.S. is abandoning Israel. It does mean the domestic consensus is getting weaker, noisier, and more difficult to manage. That is a big deal, because American policy in the Middle East has always depended not just on aircraft carriers and weapons packages, but on political bandwidth at home. If that bandwidth starts shrinking, then even a superpower begins to look less agile. And that is exactly what the current crisis is exposing. Washington is trying to hold together multiple tracks at once. Support Israel, contain Hezbollah, prevent the Iran ceasefire from collapsing, manage the Strait of Hormuz crisis, calm oil markets, and keep allies from drifting too far into open rebellion against the U.S. line. That is a lot. In fact, it may be too much for any administration to do cleanly. Reuters reported today that there is rising optimism around a possible Israel-Hezbollah ceasefire, but the very same reporting makes clear how complex the wider environment remains, with diplomacy involving Pakistan, Iran, the U.S., Lebanon, and broader disputes tied to nuclear issues and maritime pressure. That does not look like control. It looks like active management of instability, and active management of instability is not the same thing as having an answer. That is what this title gets right emotionally, even if it overstates the literal facts. Washington does not look like it has a clean answer. It has tools, it has leverage, it has influence. But a clean answer? No, because every option carries a cost. If Washington pushes Israel harder, it risks a political backlash at home and tension with its closest regional ally. If it does not push Israel hard enough, international criticism widens and diplomacy gets harder. If it leans into military pressure, it deepens the image that America is fueling escalation. If it pivots too hard toward diplomacy, it risks looking weak or inconsistent after backing force. That is not a position of comfort. That is a position of compression. And Israel is feeling its own version of that compression too. Because when more countries start condemning you, the military question changes. It is no longer only, can Israel win on the battlefield? It becomes, can Israel sustain military operations while the diplomatic environment around it gets colder, the humanitarian criticism gets louder, and even the U.S. starts facing more internal dissent over how far support should go? That is a much harder question. This is why Lebanon matters so much here. Lebanon is no longer just a side theater. It is the place where international criticism of Israel is now crystallizing most visibly. Reuters reported that recent Israeli strikes in Lebanon triggered condemnation from UN experts, from Spain, from Austria, and criticism from Turkey. AP also reported that Washington is now facilitating the first direct Israel-Lebanon talks in decades. That tells you the pressure is no longer theoretical. It is driving diplomacy in real time. And once that starts happening, narratives move fast. Israel says it is defending itself and confronting Hezbollah. Critics say it is widening war and hitting civilians. Washington says it is trying to broker stability. Others say Washington is late conflicted or too tied to Israeli decisions. Those narratives are now competing globally. And the more they compete, the harder it is for the US to simply impose one official storyline and expect the world to accept it. So what happens next? There are really two big possibilities. One, the diplomacy somehow holds. Talks on Lebanon gain traction, the Iran ceasefire survives. Washington uses its leverage just enough to create a pause, and countries like Turkey and major European states claim partial credit for pushing the region back from the edge. Or two, the ceasefire frays. Israeli operations continue drawing condemnation. Hezbollah keeps the northern front hot, and the coalition of critics grows wider, louder, and more politically costly for Washington to ignore. And if that second path unfolds, then the real danger is not that the whole world suddenly turns against Israel in one dramatic instant. The real danger is slower and more serious than that. It is that Israel becomes harder to defend politically, harder to shield diplomatically, harder to support unconditionally, and harder for Washington to manage without looking weaker, more isolated, or more divided than before. That is how power erodes in the real world. Not always in a single shock, but through repeated moments where the usual answer stops working. And that may be the most important thing happening right now. Turkey is pushing, China is positioning, Russia is exploiting, Europe is criticizing more openly, the UN is condemning, Washington is juggling too many fires, and Israel is discovering that even military strength does not automatically stop diplomatic weather from turning against you. So no, the title is not literally true in every word, but the feeling behind it, that is real. Because something is changing. The room around Israel is getting colder. The pressure on Washington is getting heavier. And the old assumption that America can always stabilize the politics of Israeli war-making no matter how ugly things get suddenly looks a lot less certain than it used to. And if that uncertainty keeps growing, then the biggest question is no longer just what Israel does next. It is whether Washington still knows how to stop the map from moving against it.